Welcome to a world where darkness isn't just the absence of light, but the place where things you can't explain begin to unfold. In today's video, you'll witness 3 chilling tales where isolation, curiosity, and sometimes fear lead ordinary people into unimaginable situations. They never knew what they were truly risking, and you won't believe what happens next. But before we dive in, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a terrifying story from our channel. Are you ready? Brace yourself, and be sure to drop a comment below sharing your thoughts. Would you dare stay in the dark? Let us know what you think, and remember to warn your loved ones. The stranger in the rental house. Jack had never imagined that the quiet town would be so isolating. The roads were long and winding, with no signs of life, and the houses sat forgotten, like ancient relics of a past long buried. When he saw the house in the online listing, something about it struck him. It was perfect for his fresh start. Isolated, with no one around to ask questions, no one around to dig up his past. When he arrived at the house, it was as if time had forgotten it. The house stood tall and old, with ivy creeping up the stone walls, covering much of the original wooden frame. The windows were grimy, and the front yard was overgrown, with branches hanging low and casting eerie shadows. As he stepped out of his car, a chill ran through him, despite the warm weather. Jack paused for a moment, feeling a sense of dread that he couldn't quite place. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying wood. The house creaked and groaned as if it were alive, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him. But he pushed the thought away. He had rented this place to escape. Escape from the noise, the chaos, and the memories. He was here to heal, to find peace. Jack entered the house, the door opening with a long, drawn-out squeak. He stepped inside, feeling the weight of the silence press down on him. The air was musty and cold, and the floorboards beneath his feet creaked as though they hadn't borne weight in years. The place looked abandoned, though it was clear that someone had cleaned it recently. There were small touches, a vase of wilting flowers, a lamp with the light still flickering faintly, that gave the house a strange, unsettling charm. But there was something more, a presence that lingered in the corners, hidden behind the peeling wallpaper, in the cracks between the floorboards. Jack couldn't explain it. The feeling that something or someone was waiting for him. By nightfall, the house seemed to take on a life of its own. Jack, exhausted from the drive, attempted to settle in. He unpacked his things, making the place as comfortable as he could. But the noises started almost immediately. The house seemed to sigh and groan, the floorboards creaking in the distance, as though someone was walking through the rooms when he wasn't looking. The first time he heard the footsteps, he told himself it was just the house settling. But as the night deepened, the sounds grew louder, more deliberate. The noises moved from room to room, following him as he paced nervously, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. He would stop and listen only for the sounds to cease. Then, just when he thought it was his imagination, the steps would begin again. Closer this time. There were also other oddities. Objects he didn't remember placing a certain way. Things moved ever so slightly out of place. He couldn't tell if he was losing his mind or if something truly was happening. It was small at first, almost imperceptible, but it soon became impossible to ignore. In the middle of the night, Jack awoke to the sensation of someone standing at the foot of his bed. His heart raced as he strained to see through the dark. The figure, though faint and shadowy, was unmistakable. A tall, thin shape with hollow eyes. The figure was staring at him, unmoving. Jack couldn't speak. He could only lie there, frozen with fear. The figure lingered for what felt like hours before it finally faded into the shadows. The room returned to its oppressive silence, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. His body trembled with the realization that someone was sharing the space with him. The following morning, Jack tried to brush off the incident. He assumed it was just a product of exhaustion, but deep down he knew it wasn't. He began exploring the house more thoroughly, determined to find some explanation. The house felt ancient, untouched for decades. The wallpaper was peeling, and the furniture seemed like it had been in place for generations. When he ventured to the basement, Jack discovered a large, rusted key hanging on a hook in the kitchen. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to unlock the basement door. When he turned the key in the lock, the door groaned open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew was overpowering. The stairs creaked under his weight, as though they hadn't borne a footstep in years. At the bottom of the stairs, Jack's flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. It was damp and cold, and he shivered as he stepped into the space. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and discarded belongings, but one thing caught his eye: a bed, tucked away in the far corner, its sheets stained and torn. The mattress was sunken, and it looked as though it had been used recently. There were more footprints on the floor, muddy, heavy prints, leading to the bed. Jack's heart raced. He backed away slowly, not wanting to believe what his eyes were showing him. He turned to leave, but then he heard it. A soft scraping sound, like nails on the floor, coming from behind him. He spun around, shining the flashlight wildly, but there was nothing. He wasn't alone. As the days passed, Jack's unease grew. The sounds escalated, and he began finding more disturbing things. Furniture in the living room was shifted, and objects disappeared from places where he had left them. The feeling of being watched was more intense than ever, and Jack began to feel trapped. One evening, he was lying in bed when he heard the unmistakable sound of someone moving through the house. Quiet, slow footsteps creeping down the hallway. Jack's pulse quickened as he sat up, his breath shallow. He grabbed his flashlight and cautiously opened the bedroom door. The hallway was dark, silent. Suddenly, the door at the end of the hall creaked open, revealing a shadowy figure standing at the top of the stairs. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at him, its face hidden in darkness. Jack's instincts screamed at him to run, but his body refused to obey. He couldn't move. The figure slowly descended the stairs, and as it came closer, Jack could see the faint outline of its features. It was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes and a twisted, hungry grin. It opened its mouth and let out a soft, low whisper. "I've been waiting for you." The words seemed to echo in the house, reverberating off the walls. Jack finally regained control of his legs and bolted down the stairs, but when he reached the front door, it was locked. Panic surged through him as he turned back to face the shadow in the hall. But the figure was gone. Jack tried to leave the house the next morning, but something kept him there. Each time he attempted to pack up and drive away, something would pull him back. The house was no longer just a place to stay. It had become a prison. Every time he thought about leaving, his body rebelled, like some invisible force was keeping him in its grip. He began researching the house's history, desperate to understand what was happening. What he found horrified him. The house had once belonged to a family, but they had mysteriously disappeared without a trace. The locals whispered about strange occurrences in the house, about the strange disappearances that seemed to follow anyone who lived there. Jack's fear grew with each new revelation. The house wasn't just old, it was cursed. One night, after weeks of growing dread, Jack decided he could no longer stay. He packed up his belongings, determined to leave the house once and for all. But as he reached the front door, the house seemed to come alive. The air grew thick with an unnatural chill, and the walls began to groan as if the house itself were trying to keep him inside. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, trapping him inside. Jack tried to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. Desperate, he turned to face the stairs, where the figure appeared once more. this time emerging from the shadows like a nightmare made flesh. "You can't leave," it whispered. Jack screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the house. The figure advanced, its twisted grin widening. The last thing Jack remembered before everything went black was the cold hand on his shoulder, pulling him into the darkness. When the police arrived, they found the house empty, no sign of Jack. The neighbors said they hadn't seen anyone leave, but when they went inside, they found nothing unusual. The house had returned to its quiet, abandoned state, as though nothing had ever happened. But the house knew better, and so did Jack. He had become part of it now. The house had claimed him, and it would wait for its next victim. The neighbor with the knife. Emily's life had been a constant blur of stress, disappointment, and loneliness. She had spent the past year in a relentless cycle of work and personal turmoil, and her soul longed for peace. So when she found the house, a secluded, old cottage nestled deep within the forest, she knew it was exactly what she needed. The drive there was long and winding, the road barely wide enough for her car. Her phone had lost service hours ago, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath her tires and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. She arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun began its descent behind the dense trees, casting long shadows across the abandoned landscape. The house was exactly as described in the listing, charming but worn, with ivy creeping up the stone walls and a small porch that overlooked the vast woods. Emily stepped out of her car, breathing in the crisp, pine-scented air. There was no one around, not a single soul in sight. The silence was almost unnerving. She had expected peace, but this was stillness, like the world had forgotten this place existed. Still, she was determined to make it work. After the chaos of her past year, a fresh start in this quiet retreat was just what she needed. With one last glance at the empty driveway, she unpacked her belongings and went inside. The interior was cold but inviting. The wooden floors creaked beneath her feet, and the air smelled of old wood and dust, but there was something comforting about it. The house felt like it had a story to tell, and Emily was eager to listen. But something lingered in the air, a subtle tension, like the house was watching her. That evening, Emily decided to take a walk around her property. The house was surrounded by thick trees, their branches swaying gently in the wind. As she explored, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Just as she reached the edge of the woods, she saw him. A man, tall, with a gaunt face and unkempt hair, stood just beyond the tree-line. His eyes were dark, almost hollow, and his presence seemed to freeze the very air around her. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Hello," he said in a low, gravelly voice. "I'm your neighbor. Just wanted to welcome you to the area." Emily nodded politely, trying to hide her unease. "Thanks, but I didn't realize there was anyone else around here." The man didn't seem bothered by her comment. "Oh, I live a bit further down the road," he replied, stepping closer. "You'll get used to the quiet. It's the best part of living out here." His words were meant to be friendly, but his gaze was unsettling, as though he were assessing her rather than engaging in conversation. Emily took a small step back, trying to hide the discomfort rising in her chest. "Well, it's nice to meet you," she said, forcing a smile. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he just stared at her for a long moment, his eyes trailing down to her hands, then back up to her face. Felt like an eternity. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I'll be around if you need anything," he said, before turning and disappearing into the woods. Emily stood there, her heart pounding. The air felt heavier now, colder. She didn't understand why, but something about the encounter didn't sit right with her. Over the next few days, Emily tried to push the strange encounter from her mind. She unpacked, settled in, and tried to enjoy the solitude. But the house seemed to have a way of unsettling her at every turn. Small things she tried to ignore, began happening. The first was the note. It appeared on her front porch one morning, folded neatly and pressed under a rock. There was no indication of who had left it, just a single line written in dark ink. "I'm always watching." Her heart raced as she read the words. A chill crept over her, and she quickly glanced around, but there was no sign of anyone nearby. She tried to convince herself it was just a prank, maybe someone from the nearby town trying to scare her. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had left the note knew more about her than they should. The next day, the man appeared again. This time, he didn't just walk up to her house. He was already standing at the edge of her driveway, staring at her through the trees. "How's everything going?" he asked in his usual unnerving voice, stepping closer. "You're settling in okay, I hope?" Emily forced a smile. "Yes, thank you. Everything's fine." But something in his eyes, the way he lingered just a bit too long, made her stomach twist with anxiety. "I'm glad. I don't want you to feel alone out here," he said. "You know, this place can be quite lonely." And with that, he turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. That night, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone in the house. She kept hearing noises, creaks in the walls, footsteps in the hall. But every time she checked, the house was empty. Just the wind, the trees outside. Yet the dread lingered. The following morning, Emily found something new on her porch. A piece of wood, smooth and weathered, lay by the front door. She bent down to pick it up and saw that someone had carved her name into it. Emily, etched deeply into the surface, the letters uneven, jagged. Her blood ran cold. She turned the piece of wood over in her hands, trying to make sense of it, but there was no explanation. The man had been here again. She knew it. But why? Why her? The paranoia set in, gnawing at her like a persistent itch she couldn't scratch. Every night, she slept fitfully, jumping at every sound. But each morning, the world outside remained as still as ever. The peaceful, almost eerie silence of the woods was both a comfort and a threat. It wasn't long before the man appeared again. This time, he was standing directly on her porch when she opened the door, his face expressionless as he regarded her with cold eyes. "I see you found it," he said flatly. "I'm always here, Emily. I'm always watching." Emily took a step back, her breath quickening. "I don't know what you want, but I think you should leave." The man simply smiled, but it was a smile that sent shivers down her spine. "You'll understand soon enough." Then he turned and disappeared into the woods again, leaving Emily standing there, trembling in the doorway. The storm came that night. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the wind howled, battering the trees and rattling the windows. Emily lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The storm outside seemed to mirror the storm in her mind. The panic, the fear, the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Then, just as she began to drift off, she heard a sound. A knock at the door. Her heart skipped a beat. It was the man. She knew it was him. She rushed to the window, peering through the curtains. There he was, standing just outside the door, holding something shiny in his hand. A knife. The realization hit her like a slap. He wasn't just watching anymore. He had come for her. Panicked, she grabbed her phone and dialed the police. But the storm had knocked out the power. She was on her own. The man knocked again, louder this time, his voice echoing through the house. "Open the door, Emily. It's time for us to be together." Emily's breath came in ragged gasps as she looked around the room for something to defend herself with. Her eyes landed on a heavy lamp on the bedside table. She grabbed it, her hands shaking. She waited, listening to the slow, deliberate thud of his footsteps approaching. When the door handle turned, she swung the lamp with all her strength, hitting him in the shoulder. He staggered back, cursing under his breath, but quickly recovered. "You can't escape, Emily. You belong to me." The man lunged at her, but Emily was faster. She ran for the back door, her heart hammering in her chest, the storm outside a blur of rain and wind. She sprinted through the woods, not looking back, not caring where she was going, just away. The man was behind her, his footsteps getting closer, his breath ragged with rage. "You can't hide from me forever," he shouted. Just as she thought she would collapse, she saw headlights through the trees. The police had arrived. The man stopped, his body tense as he realized he had been outsmarted. Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the woods, leaving Emily trembling, soaked and terrified. The police took her to safety, but as she sat in the back of the cruiser, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching her. From somewhere in the dark woods, he was still there, waiting. The woman in the shadows. Mark and Erin had always dreamed of living together in a quiet suburban neighborhood. After years of working hard and dealing with the grind of city life, they were ready for a fresh start. The small house they rented seemed perfect for their new chapter. Charming, well-maintained, and nestled in a neighborhood that appeared straight out of a picture book. The houses around them were pristine, each with its manicured lawn and white picket fences. Friendly neighbors waved as they unloaded boxes into their new home, offering advice about the best local restaurants and community events. It seemed like the perfect place to start over. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, a creeping unease began to settle over the house. The gentle suburban life was comforting, but beneath that tranquility, something felt wrong. The air was thick with a subtle, unspoken tension that neither Mark nor Erin could place. The first sign that something was amiss came one evening when Mark was settling into the living room. It was late, well past midnight, and the house was bathed in the soft glow of streetlights outside. He absent-mindedly glanced toward the window, his attention drawn to the shadows outside. And there, just beyond the edge of the porch light, he saw her, a woman, standing perfectly still, her face hidden in the darkness, her eyes locked on him through the window. Mark froze, unsure whether he was imagining it. The woman didn't move. She didn't blink. She just stood there, staring. His heart raced, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. He quickly pulled away from the window, his mind racing with questions. Who was she? What was she doing out there? The woman didn't appear to be a neighbor. She wasn't dressed in anything unusual, just a long coat that blended into the shadows. But there was something unsettling about her stillness, the way she seemed to blend into the darkness, almost like part of it. Shaking off the feeling of dread, Mark tried to convince himself it was nothing. A trick of the light, a passerby in the distance. But that night, as he lay in bed, the image of her face, pale, unmoving, lingered in his mind. Over the next few nights, the woman returned. Every time Mark glanced out the window, he could see her standing there. At first on the edge of their yard, then closer to the house, her figure growing bolder and more defined as the days passed. Erin noticed her, too. At first, they both dismissed it as a coincidence, maybe a strange person in the neighborhood. But with each passing night, the woman's presence became impossible to ignore. She was always there, standing in the same spot, her eyes never leaving their house. It was as if she were waiting for something. It didn't take long before the woman began to get even more intrusive. One evening, Erin found a small note on their doorstep. It was old and crumpled, the writing scrawled hastily in dark ink. "I know what you did. You can't hide from me." The note sent chills down Erin's spine. What could it mean? And why had she written it? The next night, they both saw her standing on the porch. Mark rushed to the door, but when he opened it, the woman was gone, vanished into the night as if she had never been there at all. They both stood in the doorway, looking into the empty yard, heartbeats loud in their ears. What was happening? And why was she so fixated on them? The tension between the two friends grew, and neither could escape the nagging sense that something terrible was on the horizon. The woman's visits had escalated, but there was no explanation, no reason behind her behavior. Was she harmless, or was there a darker motive at play? One night, while Mark was out picking up groceries, Aaron stayed behind, trying to relax after a long day of work. But as he sat in the living room, the familiar weight of the air pressed down on him. The unsettling feeling that something was wrong crept over him once again. Then he heard it. A soft tapping sound, like nails on wood, came from upstairs. Aaron's heart skipped a beat. He stood up, his legs shaking slightly. He knew he wasn't imagining it. He crept cautiously toward the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The sound grew louder as he reached the landing. It was as if someone was tapping at the door of his bedroom. With his breath caught in his throat, Aaron pushed the door open. The sight that greeted him made his stomach turn. Standing in the middle of his bedroom, the woman was staring at him with wide, unblinking eyes. Her pale face was twisted in an expression of quiet rage. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence alone spoke volumes. Aaron's pulse thundered in his ears as he backed away slowly. But before he could retreat, she whispered something, her voice low and guttural, a breathless hiss in the silence. "You don't belong here." And then, as quickly as she had appeared, she vanished, slipping into the shadows like a ghost. Mark returned to find Aaron in a state of shock, pacing the living room with wide, fearful eyes. "It happened again," Aaron muttered, his voice cracking. "She's inside the house." Mark's mind raced, but he didn't know what to say. The woman had never come inside before. This was different, far more dangerous than just standing outside in the dark. The days that followed were filled with a growing sense of dread. The woman no longer lingered just outside their windows. She was in the house, in the walls, in the very air they breathed. Every creak, every whisper, felt like her presence stalking them. Then, one night, Mark returned home late to find the door wide open. His heart dropped as he called out for Aaron, but there was no response. The house was eerily quiet, no sign of Aaron. But on the floor he found a note. It was similar to the first one, but far more cryptic, far more chilling. "He's mine now. You can't save him." Panic set in. Mark searched the house frantically, every room, every corner. But there was no sign of Aaron. Only the oppressive silence and the growing sense of terror that filled the house. And then, standing at the foot of the stairs, Mark saw her. The woman. She stood in the hallway, her figure illuminated by the faint light from the street. Her eyes glowed in the dark, and her mouth twisted into an unsettling grin. "He's gone," she whispered, her voice low and malicious. "And now it's your turn." Mark's blood ran cold as she advanced, the air around him growing heavy, suffocating. He knew she wasn't just a figure in the shadows anymore. She was a force, something ancient, something far more terrifying than anything he had ever imagined. The police arrived shortly after Mark fled the house, but by then the woman was gone. No trace of her remained, not even a footprint. And Aaron was still missing, his disappearance as inexplicable as the woman's sudden presence. In the days that followed, Mark desperately tried to uncover the truth. He dug into the house's history and found something unsettling. The house had a previous tenant, a man who had vanished without a trace, much like Aaron. The police report from his disappearance matched Mark's own experience too closely for comfort. The only thing the reports noted was an odd detail. Neighbors had reported seeing a woman in the shadows, standing in the yard, watching the house for days before the man disappeared. The woman was no stranger. She had been here before. She was waiting for them. As Mark stood on the porch, looking into the woods where the woman had once stood, he realized the truth. There was something far darker at play here. The house wasn't just haunted by a ghost. It was haunted by something far older, far more malevolent. The woman in the shadows wasn't just a ghost. She was a predator, and she wasn't finished yet. And so, the stories we've shared tonight leave us with more questions than answers. The shadows, the whispers, the figures lurking just beyond the light. But remember, every dark corner hides a secret. And sometimes, the greatest fear is knowing that something is watching you, waiting for you to let your guard down. Will you ever truly escape the grip of the unknown? Or will these eerie tales follow you into the silence of your own home? The truth is, some things are better left undisturbed until they come for you. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the fear, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another terrifying story. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you've ever experienced something you can't explain, we want to hear it. Who knows, maybe we'll feature your story next time. Until then, keep the lights on, just in case.